We're continuing and concluding our discussion of Kate Mann's Down Girl, talking about misogyny. So in the fourth chapter, she continues to talk about misogyny. She makes the theory a little bit more explicit and connects it with a notion of entitlement. So for her, a social environment is misogynistic for a specific subset of girls and women within that social environment, inasmuch as they face hostility of a kind that serves to police and enforce gendered norms and expectations within historically and to some extent currently patriarchal order. An action is misogynistic inasmuch as it's a product of or conducive to a social environment's misogyny. So note that misogyny is a property of social environments. It can also be a property of actions. Now, what this rests on is a patriarchal understanding of a certain set of coded norms, coded goods, which resolve into certain norms associated with those goods. So in a patriarchal society, there are certain feminine coded goods and services that are, quote, hers to give. These are attention, affection, admiration, sympathy, sex, and children, safe haven, nurture, security, soothingness, comfort, and so on. These are supposed to be feminine coded goods that are attached to women that women are supposed to provide. And then there's those that are his for the taking. So these are masculine coded perks and privileges, power, prestige, public recognition, rank, reputation, honor, face, as in the language of saving face, respect, money and wealth, hierarchical status, upward mobility, status conferred by having a high-ranking woman's loyalty, love or devotion, etc. So in a patriarchal society, these things are not just things that people can exhibit regardless of their gender identity or gender expression, but rather things that are coded, that are to be provided for or reserved for people depending on your gender. And these are just a list of those things. Now, there are certain misogynist norms associated with those goods. So a woman is obligated to give feminine coded services to someone or another, preferably one man who is her social equal or better, by lights of, say, racist, classist, or heteronormative values, at least insofar as that person wants such goods and services from her. So she's obligated to give feminine coded goods, and she's prohibited from having or taking masculine coded goods, particularly away from dominant men at minimum, and perhaps from other men as well, insofar as he wants or aspires to receive or retain them. So there are certain masculine coded perks and privileges that are reserved for men. And if women ask for them or take them, then she is acting out of turn, acting contrary to the gendered expectations of a patriarchal system. Now, misogyny is going to be what happens to police and enforce these social norms that are attached to these feminine and masculine coded goods. A dominant man needs to be able to assess the genuineness of coded goods, so it's not enough that a woman provides these goods, but they must be provided honestly, or it must be due to loyalty. It must be because the woman wants to give them. So there will be often tests of a woman's authenticity. And you'll often hear in misogynistic language of a woman being fake in her giving of praise or attention and whatnot. A dominant man will also need power over a woman for instrumental purposes, not only for those values of their own sake. So these things might be good for their own sake. However, they're also good for instrumental purposes for a man to, say, achieve power, prestige, public recognition, and so on. Jung in the Five Faces of Oppression talks about these things in the context of exploitation, how women might be asked for certain kinds of sympathy, sex, care, and so on, such that that provides the opportunity for, in this case, men or dominant men to pursue the very things that they can pursue. So the kind of classic 1950s image of a woman doing the housework and a man going out into the business sphere, well, the fact that the woman did the housework and was able to care for the children, all of this unpaid labor, made it possible for the man to spend so much time at work or to pursue the kind of creative opportunities that a professional might want to pursue. So we can reanalyze our Elliot Rodger case. Elliot Rodger was upset at the unfairness of the lack of a, quote, hot woman. So what he wanted, what he thought was due to him, what he thought women were obligated to give him, was affection, attention, admiration, sex, love, and so on. He also wished for a woman to confer on him a higher social status that he saw other lesser, quote, men experience. These are goods that are conceived of being owed to him. So there's this idea that he's entitled to them by some woman, or maybe women in general. And women in general have an obligation to give that to him. Now, if a woman denies these goods or services, there's a sense of perversion. Who does she think she is? Which might result in resentment on behalf of the man, not unlike the customer at a restaurant example that we gave in the last lecture. Now, Kate Manne wants to say that these feminine coded goods actually are valuable. I think there's sometimes a trend, there certainly in some feminist strains, which is to say women should be able to value these things, that this is probably part of the problem of patriarchy, is that women can't pursue these things, and these things are really the valuable things. Well, these things are valuable in a patriarchal status. They're definitely in a patriarchal system considered maybe more valuable, but that's not to say that these things aren't valuable as well. She thinks that one reason why this gender distinction between goods persists, and you can see this on page 110, is because the goods truly are valuable. The things that are feminine coded goods are genuinely things that humans desire and value. They are genuinely good, and not having them is a lack. It's quite natural that people want them. Some might be even needed. Consider that as well as affection, adoration, indulgence, and so on. Such feminine coded goods and services include simple respect and love and acceptance and nurturing and safety, security, and safe haven. There's a kindness and compassion, moral attention, care and concern, and soothing. These forms of emotional and social labor go beyond the more tangible reproductive and domestic services that may be less expected of a woman, or else have become more evenly divided in some heterosexual relationships. The less tangible forms of work, nevertheless, are still work, but they aren't, quote, busy work whose, quote, ought to be doneness owes to capitalist ideology that misleads about what a good and meaningful human life must look like. Feminine coded work does need doing, which is why it is, quote, never done, as the sexist proverb goes. And this is so not only in the home, but also in the workplace, and not only in the private, but also in public spheres and in many civic interactions, if they are to be civil. So it's no surprise that this work is often safeguarded by moral sanctions and internalized as, quote, to be done by women. Then there's the threat of the withdrawal of social approval if these duties are not performed, and the incentive of love and gratitude if they are done willingly and gladly. And if women are not only tasked with doing more than their fair share, but are also subject to more serious negative consequences for shirking their putative duties, then this is, of course, compounds the problem. She will give, and he will take, in effect, or else she may be punished when it comes to the relevant feminine-coded forms of caregiving labor. The publicity of many of these sanctions further serves to enforce this gendered economy of moral and social labor. In other words, misogyny directed towards one woman in public life may serve as a warning to others not to follow her lead, or even to publicly lend their support to her. Women's support may also be jealously guarded and hoarded for a men's benefit. This, together with norms of loyalty, may make a woman's showing solidarity with misogyny's victims dangerous. She says that she'll talk about more of this on the final chapter, and you can go read that if you'd like. So to summarize, misogynistic punishment occurs when a woman attempts, or a girl attempts, to claim something the patriarchal system deems either hers to give, his to give her without her giving him, or his alone for the taking. So there are a couple norms that women are expected to follow in a patriarchal system. 1, don't ask for the kinds of things you're meant to be giving. 2, don't ask for the goods or services that a man once might have provided when the sorts of goods women gave in return were less contested and more available. And then 3, don't ask for or try to take masculine-coded perks and privileges so long as he desires them or some other man does. So the second point here, I think, sometimes gives students some confusion, and we can summarize it as such. So the claim here is, don't ask for goods or services as he once might have provided when sorts of goods that women gave in return were less contested and more available. So what she's saying here is that there might be conditions in which a man might provide things to a woman or provide opportunities. I kind of think of this in the context of if you've had a male or a man boss who says, look, they're very kind, they let you take maybe extra breaks, or maybe they give you allow you to take time off to like see your kids if you're a woman, I'm assuming from this perspective. And then all of a sudden that person stops giving those things to you or stops giving you those allowances. You might have thought that that was just the terms of the employment in this circumstance, or that your boss was actually just on average a very nice person. But what Manne is suggesting is that maybe, at least in our pet case or our pet scenario, he's only like that because he's currently receiving the kind of attention from women, maybe other coworkers, maybe his spouse at home or something, that makes him more amenable to being more generous with certain kinds of privileges that he might dish out in the workplace. And so the idea here is that if all of a sudden you no longer get those things from, say, your boss in this case, you can't ask for them. You shouldn't ask for those goods or services that he used to provide when he's got the sorts of goods that women gave on average, right? So the idea is you're not entitled to those things that he was giving you. Those things were conditional on at least some women giving him the kind of attention that patriarchal society suggests that he should be receiving from women. So she thinks that there's going to be a couple predictions that are borne out here. So a patriarchal society will appreciate right-wing women. So women that gain power in, say, kind of far-right, more sexist or more patriarchal settings, that power is going to be tolerated if it's wielded in service of patriarchal interests. So even some brands of feminism might even be appropriated for the service of patriarchy. We actually see some of this happening in the context of transgender rights in the United States. So some brands of feminism, usually trans-exclusionary radical feminism, will be appropriated by the patriarchy for pursuit of certain kinds of policing mechanisms of trans people's identities and distribution of rights and privileges. As well, catcalling, right? So a male bids for women's attention. That's what catcalling is going to amount to, which she is held to owe him, right? So catcalling, the idea behind it is that a woman is to return that attention to a man. It's a man saying, you owe me attention, or you need to smile at me, or you are to look pretty for me. So why don't you smile more? That kind of stuff. And this evinces a sense of entitlement to openly rank her. It focuses on not allowing her to turn inward and think her own thoughts. She's not allowed to withdraw from him or be averse to the attention that he foists upon her. The man usually might resolve this. The person who catcalls might say, well, she must really like it, or smile, sweetheart. These things express the demand that a woman's face be emotionally legible, or that she, deep down, this is actually what a woman wants. As well, she calls this the shame in the citadel. Men will not stand for women to be present in men's spaces because they don't want to be shamed in the face of her eyes. And so I'll read you a quote here. On page 116, she says, in Susan Faludi's 2000 treatment of the previously all-male Citadel, the military college in South Carolina, the male cadets were highly averse to, indeed furious about, the idea of admitting a female cadet. For her admission robbed them of their privacy and subsequent freedom from the risk of humiliation and shame in women's eyes, given the hazing rituals and intense competition between them, among other things. They treated the student so poorly that she only lasted a week there. So note that face and women's respect, women's face, honor, reputation, rank, respect, these are things that are owed to men, and in this case by women, right? So of particular significance to the male cadets was the prospect of A, being dressed down by the higher ranking cadets in her presence, B, having to do feminine coded domestic work when she was around to do it instead, and C, they're not only breaking down and crying in front of her, but also comforting each other, as was apparently common and done tenderly between bouts of brutal bullying. So her presence within those walls stood to deprive the male cadets of that to which they felt entitled, in the form of a guarantee against winding up, quote, shamefaced in her eyes. Quote, the absence of women makes us understand them better, in an aesthetic kind of way. We appreciate them more because they are not here, end quote, explained the senior regimental commander, Norman Doucette, to Faludi in 2000. Right, so the idea here is that there will be certain gendered spaces to protect the certain kinds of rights or privileges that are owed to men. Also, there's this bit about punishing homosexuality. So women who do not desire men may be demanded to direct her attention or her energy outward. Maybe in the case of her employment, she may be rewarded for attending men rather than women. And if she does not, she is maybe condemned as selfish or narcissistic, subject to homophobic and anti-poly bigotry, deemed maybe a race traitor. Her honesty and loyalty might be put into question. There's also a famous or very common thing that happens with respect to lesbian women of misogynistic or sexist men and homophobic men saying, well, you just haven't been with the right man. You really deep down would find men very appealing or attractive, which is another way of denying women sexual agency. So I thought that a nice, interesting way to show maybe some of the ways that these gendered goods are, or these goods are gendered and relegated for particular people, is to talk about orgasm rates. This information was pulled from that documentary I think I mentioned in the last video, which you can go find it on Netflix. It's Netflix Explained, and I believe it's the one on female orgasm. I think that's the one. But here are some screenshots of some of the data or some of the stuff here. And you can see a difference amongst orgasm rates amongst college students. So this is whether someone had a first hookup, right? So 11% of women on the first hookup orgasmed, whereas 31% of men did. So men are orgasming at a 3 times higher rate than women are on the first hookup. These numbers go up for the second and the third hookups, right? So women will have an orgasm on the second or third at a 16% rate, whereas men at a 43% rate. And then fourth or higher, you see that women are barely just above what men generally receive on the first hookup. And the idea here is that sex or sexual pleasure is reserved primarily for men, and women are there to be geared towards men's sexual pleasure. And this is one example. There are a couple other graphs. So there's another set, men and women reporting the woman had an orgasm in a recent hookup. So when men and women engaged in oral sex, men, 56% of them reported that the woman had an orgasm in a recent hookup, whereas 29% of women say that they did. When it came to intercourse, it was 60% for men and 32% for women, and then 81% for men and 53% for women in intercourse and oral sex. So this is the idea that, well, there's definitely some different views about perceived orgasming versus actual orgasming. There could be all sorts of different explanations behind this. Maybe one that rings true is that men on average either aren't paying attention, or women are pressured to tell men that they are having an orgasm to make them feel better about sexual performance, or amongst other reasons. You can also see how this changes over time, right? So orgasm rate amongst college students. So this is, I should have showed this before, but anyway, once women or men are in a relationship, these numbers actually increase greatly. So this is just the orgasm rate among college students, and we've looked at the data for the first, second, and third, and the fourth or higher hookup. And then we find once partners are in a relationship that they have actually a much higher rate. Notably, though, women even in a sexual relationship or in a long-lasting relationship, they have just as much orgasm rates as men in their fourth or higher hookup. So these numbers are still lower than men on average. So this suggests that perhaps there's something about being in a relationship that maybe helps, even out the kinds of sexual satisfaction that's enjoyed. Maybe there's a lot more communication. There's a lot more discussion about what people want. You are in a relationship for a long time, and you might think, I can't keep doing this, and not have, some kind of, something going for me. Here's the last graph that I'll show you on this. This is comparing, so those were all with respect to heterosexual relationships, but we also have data from both heterosexual and homosexual relationships and bisexual relationships, and you can see the differences here. So the numbers here indicate reports of own orgasm frequency. So heterosexual women and lesbian women, bisexual women, heterosexual men, gay men, and bisexual men. So the shaded regions, you can see the kinds of responses that you get. So 59% of lesbian women, for example, always have an orgasm during the past month, or always have an orgasm when they've had sex in the past month, whereas 33% of heterosexual women do, similar to bisexual women. And then usually, so, the women that are having the most amount of orgasms seem to be lesbian women. Rarely, so you see the number here, these are people that are usually or always having orgasms, and that's roughly 65%, whereas here you have something like 88% of lesbian women are having orgasms every time. And then here you have basically roughly the same rates for bisexual women as you do for heterosexual women. If you look at men, heterosexual men are having orgasms the most, it looks like, 75%. When you add 20 for usually, it's roughly 95% of the time heterosexual men are having orgasms. Gay men as well and bisexual men are having frequent orgasms. It looks like they're roughly about the same. But men are generally on average having more orgasms than women are in a certain relationship. And some people might say, hey, well, that's just because, it's maybe more hard or difficult for women to have orgasms, but that kind of doesn't always play out if you think about it in the context of gay, lesbian, or lesbian relationships for women. It seems like they're having just as high rates as this category over here. Now, one explanation for this is that, and it ties into the notion of patriarchal standards and scripts that are given. Some psychologists suggest that the reason why this is happening is not just because maybe in this case women know women's bodies better or something like that, but rather because heterosexual pairings tend to have a lot of scripts that tell from patriarchal society that tells them how sex is supposed to happen. Those scripts are talked about in movies, in pornography, in various other cultural artifacts, maybe told by parents or families or whatnot, friends, etc. Magazines like Cosmopolitan or something. I don't know if anyone reads Cosmopolitan anymore. But there's all this kind of sexual advice that's geared towards heterosexual relationships. And much of it, the argument here, is that it's geared towards male pleasure primarily. For gay people, gay women, gay men, that the scripts are rather different, right? There are not a lot of patriarchal scripts that are concerned about gay sexual satisfaction. So on average, if anything, gay sexual relationships are considered or have been considered for a very long time as something of a perversion, something that we don't talk about, and so on. And so right off the bat, lesbian women, gay men, and bisexual folk that are engaging in same-sex relations, they have to make their own scripts. They have to They have to make their own standards of how they want to engage sexually with other people. And so the idea is that freed from those patriarchal scripts, they're more able to very quickly or more easily talk about, okay, well, what would you like? What seems like it would feel good to you, and so on. And so you actually see with heterosexual relationships, long-term heterosexual relationships, numbers that start approaching the categories for lesbian and gay women. And the argument there is, again, the same thing, that communication is more open. You realize in a long-term relationship that the scripts that you are told by society actually don't really apply to you as much as you thought that they did. And so you renegotiate those scripts to better satisfy the individual needs of your partner. So all those numbers were really just to show you an idea of different gendered coded goods in a patriarchal system, how those patriarchal scripts dictate who is owed what, who has an obligation to give what, and in that context, it was just sexual satisfaction. Moving on to conclude here is a discussion of shame and murder. And so she wants to talk about the owing of women's loyalty and respect and face for men can have a really dark consequence. So women tend to serve as men's witnesses. So if some male-coded good is taken away from him, he might attempt to do away with the onlooker or destroy the eyes of the world, to put it in that language, to avoid the feeling of shame or embarrassment. If you look at page 122, you have a case of Chris Foster. So family annihilators have been distinguished from other kinds of mass murderers and have begun to be studied only recently. One such case was Chris Foster, a British man who invented a kind of safety valve to use in drilling on an oil rig. The valve was the greatest valve. He made a huge amount of money. He bought a fleet of luxury cars and a mansion in Shropshire, into which he installed his wife, Jill, and his daughter, Kirsty. He had affairs with many women, having a thing for blondes, apparently, but his wife put up with it. He wasn't a good-looking man, but his money gave him confidence, according to his sister-in-law, quoted in a story by the writer John Ronson. Foster had a large collection of guns and belonged to a clay pigeon shooting club. The other men who were members knew him as a loving husband, an affectionate father. He went shooting at a barbecue there one ostensibly unremarkable afternoon. But that night, at home, he shot his wife and daughter in the back of their heads, killing them. He set fire to all his possessions and his mansion, on which he'd poured oil. Then he committed suicide as blazed his last bonfire. So does it surprise you to learn the reason? I would hazard that it doesn't. What happened? He had gone bankrupt after a series of bad business decisions. He was going to lose everything. The possessions he burned were due to be repossessed the next day by the plaintiffs. Trying to understand this crime, Ronson found it mysterious until the moment he didn't, and its logic clicked into focus. Sitting in the well-appointed kitchen of a friend of Chris's, Ian, outside the beautiful, well-manicured town of Maysbrook, which Chris and other self-made millionaires had populated, Ronson realizes not only why Chris did it, but why he did it in the way in which he did. Here's Ronson. As I sit in Ian's kitchen, it suddenly makes sense to me that Chris Foster would choose to shoot Jill and Kirsty in the back of their heads. It was as if he was too ashamed to look at them. Maybe the murders were a type of honor killing, as if Foster simply couldn't bear the idea of losing their respect and the respect of his friends. Many of Chris's friends also found his behavior, not only taking his own life, but the lives of his family members, quite intelligible. It's startling to hear Foster's friends talk about how they empathize with his actions. I wouldn't have guessed how on the edge people in this Shropshire enclave can be, and how easy it is when lives start to go wrong, when their manhood and the trappings of their wealth are threatened, for the whole thing just to unravel. Unraveling is one word for it, and notice who it places at the center of the story. The unraveling of the man's life. So she then talks about a couple other cases, but the idea here, she thinks, is that these murders are tied to a man's idea about gender roles and his place within the family. There are a variety of ways for men to be men, but what really is happening in family annihilation is that these are usually men who will reach a tipping point about various things within the particular category of family annihilator. And she gives a couple cases. There's blame towards ex-wives or lovers, humiliation by external events, feeling let down by one's own family, protection from external threats, and an inability to cope with a woman's increasing social status. So those kinds of things can be triggers for a man who's wrapped up in certain sexist or gendered notions of goods that are owed to him, or that he then subsequently has lost, or that he never was able to acquire. That can cause a certain resentment or an anger or a feeling that you've lost everything that makes you, say, a man, or makes you who you are. These killings almost occur exclusively in heterosexual relationships. And they might increase. So when the economy is in decline, when jobs are scarce, when tensions are high, and the control that these men seek becomes harder to maintain, that behavior typically plunges the marriage into crisis. And that often prompts the wife and children to maybe try and leave. The resulting lack of control triggers feelings of humiliation, and that eventually leads to the father to reassert his power in a final paroxysm of violence. Or perhaps he murders his family members because he thinks of it as a way of rescuing them from the hardship and the shame that he will bear by the consequence of bankruptcy. Some people have noted that in our current context with the coronavirus, that there's a fear of family members being home with partners who are likely to inflict some kind of violence upon the women in the family or the children in the family. That loss of employment, the kind of insecurity that happens with these kinds of very, what's the right word, destructive events, these kind of exogenous shocks to the status quo, that can really throw things for a loop for people, and that can heighten these kinds of tensions that are already latent. So you could imagine a case like this where because of coronavirus, someone loses their job. A man loses their job and goes home, feels that they can't provide, they can't support, they feel everything's going to be lost to them, and they might, as is all too common, take it out on their wife or their children. So this is on the far end of the spectrum. I mean, these things can be much smaller too. So this is kind of the consequence of shame to a very violent end. But shame can manifest in a lot of smaller ways of policing what women owe to different people. And I urge you just to think about different ways that this might have played out, either in your own life or from stories that you've heard from friends. If this were a classroom setting, we'd have a discussion perhaps about various ways that you've identified some of this behavior, maybe at a smaller scale, hopefully. You can read how she extrapolates this to politics more generally, but it's not that important, I think, for the general context here. So again, the key points to draw from this lecture is the idea of how misogyny applies to social environments and actions, this notion of feminine and masculine coded goods. This is a story that's told by patriarchal societies, how that resolves or has consequences for different norms that are supposed to be enjoyed by members of different genders, and how feminine coded goods are going to be owed to men in some way. They have an obligation, women have an obligation to give them to men. How misogyny is going to happen when women fail to give it to them, or they start to ask for or claim something that should, quote, otherwise be available to men or reserved for men. She thinks this bears some predictions about the kind of women that are going to be accepted under, like the kind of women that take certain masculine coded goods are going to be accepted if they're for the purpose of furthering patriarchal norms. It explains the outcome of catcalling. It explains this idea of shame, and then how this idea of shame can push further into very violent consequences. So we can now account for these kinds of murders in ways that's not just about, I don't know, a person losing it, but the actual gendered elements of that person losing it and the consequences for the victims of that behavior.